My son stood in my kitchen with his eyes empty and his voice cold and told me he had drained every dollar from my savings to pay off his wife's family's gambling debts. Before I could even speak, my daughter-in-law stepped closer and said that her family needed the money more than I ever would. In that moment, something inside me twisted not from anger, but from the crushing realization that the people I had loved and supported had quietly turned me into a resource to be exploited. I walked to the bank that afternoon, planning to close the account that no longer belonged to me, and the manager looked at the screen, then at me, and pulled me aside with a quiet urgency. "Sir, you need to see this," he whispered, and the printout he showed me made my blood turn cold. Nothing was what I thought it was. Their betrayal was deeper. Their plan was bolder, and their secrets were far more dangerous than I ever imagined. What they had done behind my back was not just selfish, it was unforgivable, and it opened a door to a truth I had never expected to find. They thought they had taken everything from me, but they had no idea what I still had left, and they certainly never imagined how far I was willing to go to make sure this time I was the one who ended everything. My name is Raymond Doyle. I am 67 years old, a retired civil engineer who spent 4 decades designing bridges across New England. I built things meant to last steel and concrete structures that would carry families safely across rivers and valleys long after I was gone. I never imagined that the foundation of my own life could crumble so quickly, or that the people I trusted most would be the ones to break it. The morning it all began was cold even for Vermont in late November. Frost clung to the windows of the house I had shared with my wife Eleanor for 41 years. She passed 2 years ago, taken by cancer that moved faster than any of us expected. Some days it still feels like she just stepped out to the garden and will be back any moment. I keep her white lilies by the kitchen window, the ones she planted the spring before she got sick. Every morning I water them and talk to her photograph on the mantel. I tell her about the weather, about what I'm planning to cook for dinner, about the cardinals that visit the bird feeder she hung from the old oak tree. It probably sounds foolish to anyone listening, but those quiet conversations keep her close. They remind me that love doesn't end just because someone is gone. That particular morning, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open, a cup of black coffee cooling beside me. I needed to pay the electric bill and check on my savings account, a routine task I had done hundreds of times before. My finances were modest but sufficient: the pension from my engineering career, Social Security, and the $47,000 I had saved over the years for emergencies, and eventually to leave something behind for Daniel, my only son. I typed in my password and waited for the screen to load. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway interrupted me. I wasn't expecting anyone. Through the window I saw Daniel's silver sedan, and my heart lifted for a moment. He didn't visit often, maybe 3 or 4 times a year since Eleanor's funeral. He lived 2 hours south with his wife Sabrina and their daughter Emily. I understood that life was busy, that young families had their own demands. Still, I missed him. I missed the boy who used to help me in the garage, handing me wrenches and asking endless questions about how things worked. I opened the front door before they reached the porch. Daniel looked different. His shoulders were tense, his eyes darting everywhere except toward mine. He mumbled a greeting and stepped inside quickly as if being watched. Behind him came Sabrina, and the air in the room seemed to change the moment she crossed the threshold. She walked in like she owned the place, her heels clicking sharply against the wooden floor. Eleanor had refinished herself 20 years ago. She didn't smile. She didn't ask how I was doing. She simply glanced around the living room with an expression I can only describe as appraising, like a buyer inspecting a property. "We need to talk," Sabrina announced, settling herself onto Eleanor's favorite armchair without being invited. Daniel remained standing, fidgeting with his coat zipper. "What's going on?" I asked, looking between them. "Is everything all right? Is Emily okay?" "Emily's fine," Daniel said quickly. "It's just, we're in a situation, Dad, a financial situation." Sabrina cut in before he could continue. "We're facing a crisis. Daniel's business has had setbacks and we need help. Family helps family, right?" Her voice was smooth, but there was something underneath it. Something cold and expectant, as if my agreement was already assumed. I felt uneasy, though I couldn't yet name why. "What kind of help are we talking about?" "We'll discuss the details," Sabrina said dismissively. "But first, maybe you should check your accounts. Make sure everything is in order on your end." Something in her tone made my stomach tighten. I walked back to the kitchen table where my laptop still sat open. I clicked refresh on the bank page. The numbers loaded, and for a moment I thought there must be a glitch, some kind of technical error. I blinked and looked again. The balance read $312.47. $47,000. Everything I had saved was gone. I scrolled through the transaction history with trembling hands. Transfer after transfer amounts ranging from a few hundred to several thousand, all made over the past 6 months. Accounts I didn't recognize. Authorizations I never gave. Daniel. I said, my voice barely steady. What is this? What happened to my money? My son couldn't meet my eyes. It was an emergency, Dad. We were going to pay it back. We just needed what? I turned to face them both. You took everything, without asking, without telling me. Sabrina didn't flinch. She watched me with calculating eyes, no trace of guilt or remorse on her face. If anything, she seemed almost amused by my shock. You should start thinking about your future, Raymond, she said, her smile thin and cold. You're not getting any younger. The silence that followed Sabrina's words hung in the air like smoke. I stood there, laptop still open on the table, staring at the woman my son had married. In that moment, I understood something I had refused to see for years. This was not a family emergency. This was not desperation. This was calculation, pure and cold, delivered with a smile that never reached her eyes. Let me explain something to you. Sabrina continued, crossing her legs and leaning back in Eleanor's chair, as if she had always belonged there. You're 67 years old. You live alone in a house that's too big for one person. You don't travel. You don't have expensive hobbies. What exactly do you need $47,000 for? Meanwhile, Daniel and I are raising a child. We have a mortgage. We have real responsibilities. I turned to my son, waiting for him to say something, anything in my defense. Daniel kept his eyes fixed on the floor, his jaw tight, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. He looked like a man who had rehearsed his silence, who had already decided that saying nothing was safer than speaking up. Daniel, I said quietly, look at me. He didn't. Sabrina filled the space his silence left behind. We're not the villains here, Raymond. We're trying to survive just like everyone else. And honestly, have you thought about what happens when you can't take care of yourself anymore? This house needs maintenance. The winters are hard. You're not young enough to keep shoveling snow and climbing ladders. She paused, tilting her head as if considering a business proposition. You should sell the house. Move into one of those assisted living places. They take care of everything for you, meals, cleaning, medical support. It would be better for everyone. Better for everyone. The phrase echoed in my head, each word a small knife. She wasn't suggesting this out of concern for my well-being. She was clearing the board, removing obstacles. In her eyes, I was not a father, not a person who had built a life in this house, who had raised a son within these walls, who had held his dying wife's hand in the bedroom upstairs. I was an inconvenience, an old man standing between her and whatever she truly wanted. This is my home, I said, my voice steadier than I expected. Eleanor and I built this life together. I'm not leaving. Sabrina's expression flickered just for a moment before settling back into that practiced calm. Well, she said, rising from the chair, think about it. We'll be in touch. She looked at Daniel. Let's go. We've said what we needed to say. Daniel finally lifted his gaze, and for a brief second, I thought I saw something in his eyes. Shame, maybe, or the ghost of an apology he couldn't bring himself to speak. But then he turned and followed his wife to the door without a word. The screen door banged shut behind them, and I was alone in the house that suddenly felt colder than the November air outside. I sank into a kitchen chair and pressed my palms against my temples, trying to steady the storm inside my head. And then, unbidden, a memory surfaced. It was from years ago, maybe 5 or 6 summers past, when Eleanor was still healthy and the world still made sense. Maggie Collins. Eleanor's closest friend had come over for tea one afternoon. I'd walked in from the garage to find them huddled together at this very table, speaking in low voices that stopped the moment they noticed me. Just girl talk, Eleanor had said with a smile that didn't quite convince me. Later that evening, when we were alone, I asked her what they had been discussing. She hesitated before answering. I worry about Sabrina, she finally said. Something about her doesn't feel right, the way she looks at things, at people, like she's always measuring what she can take. I had dismissed it, then told her she was being overprotective, that Daniel was a grown man capable of making his own choices. Eleanor had nodded, but her eyes held a sadness I didn't understand at the time. Now, sitting in the silence she had left behind, I understood. She had seen it. She had tried to warn me, and I had not listened. I couldn't sit with these thoughts any longer. I needed answers, real answers, not the rehearsed excuses Daniel and Sabrina had offered. I grabbed my coat and keys and drove to the bank, the same branch where Eleanor and I had opened our accounts 30 years ago. The roads were quiet, the trees bare against the gray skin. As I pulled out of this driveway, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Sabrina stood at the living room window phone pressed to her ear, speaking urgently to someone. She wasn't watching the road. She was watching me. The bank was nearly empty when I arrived, just a few customers at the teller windows and the soft hum of fluorescent lights overhead. I approached the main counter, ready to demand an explanation for the unauthorized transfers, ready to fight if necessary. But before I could speak, a man in a dark suit stepped out from a side office. He was perhaps 10 years younger than me, with graying hair and a serious expression that suggested he had been expecting me. "Mr. Doyle," he said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. "My name is Gerald Whitman. I'm the branch manager." He placed a hand gently on my arm and lowered his voice further. "We need to talk. Privately." Gerald led me through a narrow hallway to a small office at the back of the bank. He closed the door behind us and gestured for me to sit in one of the 2 leather chairs facing his desk. The room was modest, a few framed certificates on the wall, a potted plant in the corner that looked like it needed water, and a window overlooking the parking lot where my truck sat alone in the gray afternoon light. He didn't sit behind his desk. Instead, he pulled the other chair closer to mine and lowered himself into it, as if what he had to say required proximity, required trust. "Mr. Doyle, I'm going to show you something," he said, reaching for a manila folder on his desk. "And I need you to stay calm. Can you do that for me?" I nodded, though my heart was already beating faster. He opened the folder and spread several printed pages across the desk between us. Transaction records, dozens of them, each one highlighted in yellow. I recognized my account number at the top of each page. The transfers dated back 6 months, sometimes 2 or 3 in a single week amounts, ranging from $300 to $5,000. All of them flowed to accounts I had never seen before, account numbers that meant nothing to me. "These are the unauthorized transfers," Gerald said quietly. $47,000 total, moved in small enough increments to avoid triggering automatic fraud alerts. Whoever did this knew exactly how to stay under the radar. I stared at the numbers, trying to make sense of the pattern. "Sabrina," I said. "My daughter-in-law. She and Daniel came to my house this morning, said they had a financial emergency, but they already had the money. They'd been taking it for months." Gerald nodded slowly. "The destination accounts are linked to a Sabrina Clark Doyle. We traced them within 24 hours of me noticing the irregularities." He paused, then pulled another document from the folder. "But that's not all, Mr. Doyle. This is what concerns me most." He placed a single sheet of paper in front of me. It was a loan application typed in official, bearing my name and social security number. At the bottom was a signature that looked almost like mine, but not quite. The loops were too round, the slant too uniform. Someone had practiced, but not well enough. $30,000, I said, reading the amount. "I never applied for this. I never signed anything." "I know," Gerald said. "That signature is a forgery. The loan was approved 3 months ago using your home as collateral. The funds were dispersed to the same accounts receiving your savings transfers." He let that sink in before continuing. "Mr. Doyle, if you don't act quickly, you could lose more than your savings. You could lose your house." The room seemed to tilt. I gripped the armrest of the chair to steady myself. $47,000 was devastating but survivable. Losing the house Eleanor and I had built our life in, that was unthinkable. That was everything. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Why not just report it to the police?" Gerald leaned back slightly, his expression shifting to something more guarded. "I've already reported it to our compliance department. They're investigating, quietly gathering evidence before escalating to federal authorities. Wire fraud, identity theft, forgery. These are serious crimes, Mr. Doyle. This isn't family drama. This is criminal enterprise." I looked at him more closely, trying to read the things he wasn't saying. "You said you noticed the irregularities. Most bank managers wouldn't catch something like this, not with transfers designed to stay under the radar. Why were you watching my account? Gerald held my gaze for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, almost gentle. Your family. I know them better than you might think. Trust me on this. What does that mean? He shook his head. I can't explain right now. Not yet. But I promise you, Mr. Doyle, I'm on your side. I have been for a long time, even if you didn't know it. The statement hung between us, strange and weighted with meaning I couldn't decipher. I wanted to press him to demand a clearer answer, but something in his eyes told me he wouldn't give one. Not today. What do I do now? I asked instead. Gerald reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small white business card. He pressed it into my hand. You need legal protection, someone who understands financial crimes and knows how to fight people like your daughter-in-law. He tapped the card. Elliot Ramsey. He's the best attorney in the state for cases like this. I've seen him dismantle schemes far more sophisticated than what Sabrina has done. I looked down at the card. Simple black text on white stock. Elliot Ramsey, attorney at law, with a phone number and address in Burlington. Call him today, Gerald continued. Don't wait. Don't try to handle this yourself or confront Sabrina directly. People like her, they're dangerous when cornered. They'll destroy evidence, lie to authorities, turn your own family against you if they can. I slipped the card into my coat pocket, feeling its slight weight like a lifeline thrown across dark water. Thank you, I said. I don't understand why you're helping me, but thank you. Gerald stood and extended his hand. I shook it, and he held on a moment longer than necessary. Mr. Doyle, he said quietly, his eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made me pay attention. Your wife would have wanted you to call him. The words stopped me cold. You knew Eleanor. But Gerald was already opening the door, his expression closing like a book being shut. Call Elliot Ramsey, he said again. Today, before Sabrina makes her next move. I drove home from the bank in a daze, Gerald's words echoing in my mind. Your wife would have wanted you to call him. How did he know Eleanor? What connection existed between a bank manager and my late wife that I had never known about? The questions multiplied with every mile, tangling together until I could barely think straight. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the afternoon sun was already fading behind the hills, and the house looked darker than usual, emptier somehow, as if it too understood that something fundamental had shifted. I didn't go inside. Instead, I sat in the truck for a long moment, staring at the white lilies visible through the kitchen window, and I knew where I needed to go. I needed to talk to Eleanor even if she couldn't answer. I needed to sit beside her and try to make sense of a world that had stopped making sense the moment Sabrina smiled at me that morning. The cemetery was quiet when I arrived, the way it always was in late November. Dead leaves scattered across the paths, and the bare trees stood like sentinels against the gray sky. I walked the familiar route to Eleanor's grave, my boots crunching on the frozen grass. But as I approached, I realized I wasn't alone. A woman knelt beside the headstone, arranging a small bouquet of white roses in the metal vase we had placed there after the funeral. She wore a dark green coat and a wool scarf wrapped around her neck, and when she heard my footsteps, she turned. Maggie Collins, Eleanor's oldest friend. They had known each other since college, had been bridesmaids at each other's weddings, had raised their children in parallel lives filled with shared holidays and long phone calls. After Eleanor died, Maggie had been at the funeral, had brought casseroles during those first terrible weeks, had called to check on me regularly for the first few months. But gradually, as grief does, we had drifted into our separate silences. I hadn't seen her in almost a year. She stood slowly brushing dirt from her knees and looked at my face. Whatever she saw there made her expression change from surprise to concern. Raymond, she said softly, what's happened? I opened my mouth to answer, but the words wouldn't come. Everything, the stolen money, the forged loan. Gerald's cryptic warnings, Sabrina's cold smile pressed against my chest like a physical weight. Maggie stepped forward and took my arm, her grip firm and steady. Come with me, she said. My house is 10 minutes from here. I'll make coffee and you'll tell me everything. Her kitchen was warm and smelled of cinnamon, a stark contrast to the cold emptiness I had left behind. Maggie set a steaming mug in front of me and sat across the table waiting. And so I told her. I told her about Daniel and Sabrina's visit, about the missing savings, about the forged loan using my house as collateral. I told her about Gerald Whitman and his strange familiarity with my family, about the business card in my pocket, and the warning that I needed legal protection before Sabrina made her next move. When I finished, my coffee had gone cold and my voice was hoarse. Maggie was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. "Raymond," she said, "there's something I need to tell you, something Eleanor asked me to keep secret unless the time came when you needed to know." I looked at her, not understanding. 3 years ago, before she got sick, Eleanor came to me. She was worried not about her health, not yet, but about Sabrina. She said she'd been watching her for years, noticing things that didn't add up. The way Sabrina looked at your house, at your savings, at everything you and Eleanor had built. The way she controlled Daniel, isolated him from old friends, made decisions for him without asking. Maggie paused, her eyes glistening. "Eleanor told me, if anything happens to Raymond after I'm gone, help him. Sabrina is not who she pretends to be." The words hit me like a blow. Eleanor had seen it. She had known long before any of this happened what Sabrina truly was. "I've been watching," Maggie continued, "quietly from a distance, but I had no proof, nothing concrete, until now." She squeezed my hand. "Eleanor also told me she prepared for the worst. She said you should check the safe, the one in your bedroom closet. There's something she left for you. And Raymond, she mentioned a name, Elliot Ramsey. She said if things ever got bad, he was the one to call." The same name Gerald had given me. The coincidence was too precise to be coincidence at all. Maggie stood and walked to a small writing desk in the corner of her kitchen. She opened a drawer and withdrew a faded envelope yellowed at the edges with handwriting I would recognize anywhere. Eleanor's handwriting. My name was written on the front in her careful script, and below it a single instruction that made my breath catch in my throat. "Only open when you feel truly betrayed." Maggie placed the envelope in my hands. "She gave this to me 2 months before she died," she said quietly. "She made me promise to hold it until the right moment. I think that moment is now." I stared at the envelope, at Eleanor's handwriting, at the words she had written, knowing someday I might need them. My wife had been gone for 2 years, but in that moment, sitting in Maggie's kitchen with her final message in my hands, I felt her presence more strongly than I had since the day she died. I called Elliot Ramsey that evening, my hand still trembling slightly as I held the business card Gerald had given me. The envelope from Eleanor sat unopened on my kitchen table. Maggie had told me to read it, but something held me back. Perhaps the fear that once I opened it, I would have to accept fully that my wife had known all along what was coming, that she had prepared for a betrayal I had been too blind to see. The phone rang twice before a calm, measured voice answered. I explained who I was, mentioned Gerald Whitman's name, and before I could say anything else, Elliot interrupted me. "Mr. Doyle," he said, "I've been expecting your call. Can you come to my office tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock? Bring everything you have." His office was in Burlington, on the 3rd floor of a brick building overlooking Church Street. The waiting room was modest but professional, with framed diplomas on the walls and a few leather chairs arranged around a low table covered in legal magazines. A receptionist offered me coffee, which I declined. My stomach was too knotted to accept anything. Within minutes, Elliot emerged from his office and shook my hand firmly. He was perhaps 55, with silver-streaked hair and sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He led me into a room lined with bookshelves and gestured for me to sit across from his desk. I had brought the transaction records Gerald had printed for me, the forged loan application, and the business card with Gerald's handwritten note on the back. I spread them across Elliot's desk and watched as he examined each document carefully, his expression growing more serious with every page. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. "This is organized financial fraud," he said flatly. "Not careless overspending, not a family misunderstanding. Someone planned this, methodically executed it over months, and designed it specifically to avoid detection. The small transfer amounts, the timing, the forged signature on the loan. This is the work of someone who has done this before." The words confirmed what I had feared but hadn't wanted to believe. "Sabrina," I said. "My daughter-in-law." "Almost certainly," Elliot agreed. "But Mr. Doyle, I need to tell you something that may surprise you. This isn't the first time I've heard your family's name." He paused, studying my reaction. "Your wife, Eleanor, came to see me about 4 years ago. She was concerned about protecting your family's assets, the house, your savings, your pension. She didn't give me specific reasons at the time, just said she wanted to make sure everything was secure in case something happened to her." I stared at him. "Eleanor never mentioned meeting with an attorney?" She asked me to keep it confidential. I helped her establish a revocable living trust that placed your primary assets under protection. The house specifically is titled in a way that makes it very difficult for anyone to leverage it without your explicit notarized consent. He tapped the forged loan application. Whoever forged this signature didn't know about the trust. The loan itself may not be enforceable, which means your house is safer than Sabrina realizes. A small wave of relief washed over me, though it was quickly swallowed by the larger tide of anger and confusion. Eleanor had protected me even from beyond the grave, but why hadn't she told me? Why had she carried this burden alone? What do I do now? I asked. Elliot leaned forward. First, you do nothing. Don't confront Sabrina. Don't tell Daniel what you know. Don't give any indication that you're aware of the fraud. People like your daughter-in-law predators, they overreach when they think they're winning. She believes you're a confused old man who doesn't understand what happened to his money. Let her keep believing that. And then we watch. We document. We let her make more mistakes. He picked up the transaction records again. Tell me about Sabrina's family. Does she have anyone she's close to, siblings, parents, anyone who might be involved? I thought for a moment. She has a brother, Kyle. I've only met him a few times at holidays. He always seemed, I searched for the right word, shady. He talked a lot about business ventures that never seemed to go anywhere. Sabrina was always whispering with him in corners away from everyone else. Elliot made a note on his legal pad. Kyle Clark. Yes, how did you know his last name? Because I've seen it before. He turned his notepad toward me, showing a list of the account numbers where my money had been transferred. 2 of these accounts are registered to a Kyle Clark. The transactions aren't just flowing to Sabrina, they're flowing through a network. This has the fingerprints of a practiced scheme, Mr. Doyle. Your daughter-in-law didn't invent this overnight. She's been doing it for a long time, possibly to other victims we don't know about yet. The realization settled over me like a cold fog. Sabrina hadn't just stolen from me. She was part of something larger, something organized, and my son was either complicit or trapped in the middle of it without understanding what he had married into. What happens next? I asked. Elliot set down his pen and looked at me with an expression that was almost predatory in its focus. Tonight, he said, she'll make another mistake, and we'll be watching. Elliot was right. Sabrina made her next mistake within 48 hours, though I didn't realize it immediately. It started with something small, an uneasy feeling I couldn't quite name. Every time I left the house that week, I had the sensation of being watched. When I drove to the grocery store, a car that looked like Daniel's sedan appeared in my rearview mirror, then turned off before I could be certain. When I walked to the mailbox, I noticed a vehicle parked at the end of my street that I didn't recognize. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the stress of everything was making me see threats where none existed. But Elliot had taught me to trust my instincts, so on a cold Thursday morning, I decided to check. I found it under the rear bumper of my truck, attached with a magnetic case no bigger than a deck of cards, a GPS tracker. Someone had been monitoring my every movement, and I knew exactly who that someone was. I photographed the device without touching it, then called Elliot immediately. He instructed me to leave it in place for now to let Sabrina believe her surveillance was undetected. Let her think she's in control, he said. The more confident she feels, the more careless she'll become. The next day, I drove to the bank to speak with Gerald about the ongoing investigation. I had barely stepped through the front doors when I heard her voice behind me, sharp and demanding. Sabrina strode into the lobby like she owned the building, her heels clicking against the marble floor. Her expression fixed in that cold mask I had come to recognize as her true face. She walked straight past me without acknowledgement and approached the main counter, demanding to speak with the branch manager about family accounts. Gerald emerged from his office, his face calm and professional. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Doyle," he said, his voice carrying just enough for me to hear. "Account information is only available to the account holder or individuals with documented authorization. I don't have any such authorization on file for you." Sabrina's composure cracked just for a moment. "This is ridiculous. My father-in-law is elderly. He needs family support to manage his finances. I'm trying to help him." "Then I suggest you ask Mr. Doyle to add you as an authorized user," Gerald replied smoothly. "Until then, I can't assist you." She turned and saw me standing near the entrance. Our eyes met and something flickered across her face. Surprise, then calculation, then that familiar cold smile. Raymond, she said sweetly, walking toward me. I didn't know you'd be here. I was just trying to sort out some confusion about the accounts. You know how complicated banking can be at your age. I said nothing. I simply watched her, letting the silence stretch between us, until she finally looked away. She left without another word, but I saw her glance back through the glass doors, her phone already pressed to her ear. That afternoon, Daniel called and asked if we could meet for coffee. His voice sounded different, tired, uncertain, nothing like the confident son I remembered from years past. We met at a small cafe in town, and when the waitress brought the check, Daniel reached for his wallet, then stopped. His face flushed red. Dad, He couldn't finish the sentence. He stared at his empty wallet, his hands trembling slightly. Let me get it, I said quietly, placing a 20 on the table. I'm sorry. The words came out barely above a whisper. Sabrina handles all our money. She gives me $50 a week for expenses. She says that's normal in marriage, that wives manage household finances. He looked up at me, and I saw something in his eyes I hadn't noticed before. Shame, fear, confusion. I don't even have access to our bank accounts. I don't know how much we have or where it goes. When I ask, she says I'm being controlling. I sat back, studying my son as if seeing him for the first time. This wasn't the behavior of a co-conspirator. This was something else entirely. Daniel wasn't Sabrina's partner in crime. He was her prisoner, trapped in a marriage that had slowly stripped away his autonomy until he couldn't even buy a cup of coffee without her permission. The anger I had felt toward him began to shift, replaced by something more complicated. Pity, grief, and a growing horror at what my son's life had become. Daniel, I said carefully, how long has it been like this? He shrugged helplessly. I don't know. It happened so gradually. First, she took over the bills because I was too busy with work. Then she started giving me an allowance because we needed to budget better. Now I have to ask permission to buy lunch. His voice cracked. Dad, I don't know what's normal anymore. That evening, I brought the GPS tracker to Elliot's office. He documented it meticulously, photographing every angle, noting the make and model, preserving it in an evidence bag. Combined with the bank footage of Sabrina demanding access to my accounts, we now had documented proof of stalking behavior, surveillance, and harassment, a pattern that any judge would recognize. Elliot set down the evidence bag and leaned back in his chair, a grim smile spreading across his face. She just handed us half our case, he said. People like her can't help themselves. That night, after returning home from Elliot's office, I stood in front of the bedroom closet for a long time. Behind the winter coats and boxes of old photographs was the safe Eleanor and I had installed 20 years ago. A fireproof steel box bolted to the floor, where we kept important documents, her mother's jewelry, and the few things we considered irreplaceable. I hadn't opened it since Eleanor's funeral, when I retrieved her will and the deed to the house. The combination was her birthday numbers I would never forget as long as I lived. The envelope Maggie had given me sat on the dresser still unopened, but Eleanor's words echoed in my mind the instructions she had written to check the safe. I knelt on the closet floor, my knees protesting against the hardwood, and dialed the combination with trembling fingers. The lock clicked open, and I swung the heavy door wide. Inside, nestled among the familiar documents and velvet jewelry boxes, was something I had never seen before. A red envelope thick with contents, with Eleanor's handwriting across the front in her careful, elegant script. For Raymond, when you need strength. My heart seized in my chest. She had placed this here without telling me, had hidden it among our most precious possessions, waiting for a day she prayed would never come. I carried the envelope to the bed and sat down heavily, staring at my name written in her hand. For a moment, I couldn't bring myself to open it. This was Eleanor reaching across the divide between life and death, speaking to me from a place I couldn't follow. Whatever was inside would change everything I thought I knew about my wife, my son, my family. But I had come too far to turn back now. I slid my finger under the seal and opened the envelope. Inside were two items. The first was a letter, several pages long, written on the cream-colored stationery Eleanor had used for important correspondence. The second was a manila folder, thick with documents. I set the folder aside and unfolded the letter, and as I read the first lines, tears I hadn't known I was holding began to fall. My dearest Raymond, the letter began. If you're reading this, then what I feared has finally happened, and I'm so sorry I'm not there to face it with you. I've spent the last 5 years watching, worrying, and preparing for a day I hoped would never come. but I know you, my love. I know your kindness, your faith in people, your endless capacity to forgive. These are the things I fell in love with 40 years ago. They are also the things that make you vulnerable to someone who sees generosity as weakness. I always worried about Sabrina. From the first time Daniel brought her home, something felt wrong. She looked at our house, at our savings, at everything we built together with eyes that measured and calculated. She didn't see a family. She saw an opportunity. I tried to tell myself I was being unfair, that I was simply a protective mother who would never think any woman was good enough for her son. But the feeling never went away. It only grew stronger. Over the years, I documented what I observed. Small things at first: the way she controlled Daniel's schedule, isolated him from old friends, made decisions without consulting him. Then larger things: questions about our finances that felt more like reconnaissance than curiosity, comments about how wasteful it was for two people to live in such a big house. I kept notes, dates, specific incidents. I didn't want to poison your hope or damage your relationship with Daniel, but I couldn't ignore what I was seeing. So I prepared. I met with an attorney named Elliot Ramsey and established a revocable living trust that protects our home. The house cannot be sold, mortgaged, or transferred without your explicit notarized consent. I also spoke with my cousin Gerald at the bank. Yes, Raymond. Gerald Whitman is my cousin, though I asked him to keep our connection private. He promised to watch over your accounts and alert you if anything suspicious ever occurred. I'm not proud of keeping these secrets from you. Every day I wanted to tell you, to share the burden I was carrying, but I knew you would defend. Daniel would give Sabrina the benefit of the doubt, would choose hope over suspicion. That is who you are, and I love you for it. But kindness without boundaries is an invitation to be used. I learned that too late with my own family, and I refuse to let you learn it the same way. If you are reading this letter, then my fears were justified. Sabrina has done something to hurt you, and now you need to fight back. Do not be ashamed of that fight. Do not let guilt or love for Daniel prevent you from protecting yourself. You have worked your entire life to build something meaningful. You deserve to keep it. The folder contains everything you need: the trust documents, my notes on Sabrina's behavior over 5 years, contact information for Elliot and Gerald. They both promised to help you if this day ever came. Trust them, Raymond. They are good men, and they loved me too. I wish I could be there with you. I wish I could hold your hand and tell you that everything will be all right. But since I cannot, I leave you these words instead. You are stronger than you know. You are wiser than you believe. And you are loved by me always, even now, even from wherever I am watching over you. Fight for yourself, my darling. Fight for our home. And when it's over, live fully and joyfully, because that is what I want for you more than anything else in this world. Forever yours, Eleanor. I set down the letter and wept. Not the quiet tears I had shed at her funeral, surrounded by mourners and rituals. These were the deep, wrenching sobs of a man who finally understood how much he had been loved, how completely he had been protected, and how alone he was not. Eleanor had seen everything. She had prepared for everything. And even from beyond the grave, she was still fighting for me. I opened the manila folder and found exactly what she had promised. The trust documents, notarized and official. A handwritten list of dates and observations spanning 5 years, each entry a small piece of the puzzle that was Sabrina. And a final note written on a separate card. If you need help, contact Elliot Ramsey and Gerald Whitman. They promise to protect you. The connections I had been struggling to understand suddenly made sense. Gerald's strange familiarity at the bank, his knowledge of my family, his insistence that Eleanor would have wanted me to call Elliot. They weren't coincidences. They were pieces of a safety net my wife had woven in secret, a network of protection she had built, knowing she might not live to activate it herself. I walked to the living room where Eleanor's photograph still sat on the mantel beside her white lilies. The woman in the picture smiled back at me, frozen in a moment of happiness from our 35th anniversary. I touched the glass, gently tracing the outline of her face. "You never stopped protecting me," I whispered. "Even now." The days that followed Eleanor's revelation felt different. I moved through my routines with a new sense of purpose, watering her lilies each morning, not just as a ritual of grief, but as a promise that I would honor what she had built. I brought the manila folder to Elliot's office and watched as he studied Eleanor's meticulous notes, her careful observations spanning 5 years of watching Sabrina with the sharp eyes of a mother who sensed danger long before anyone else. When he finished reading, he looked at me with something close to admiration. Your wife was remarkable, he said quietly. She built a case against Sabrina without even knowing she was building one. These notes, combined with the financial records Gerald provided, give us a foundation, but I want to dig deeper. Someone like Sabrina doesn't start at 67-year-old retired engineers. There's always a history. He was right. Within a week, his investigation began to yield results. Elliot called me to his office on a gray Tuesday afternoon, the kind of day that makes Vermont feel like it exists outside of time. He had a new folder on his desk, thinner than Eleanor's, but somehow more ominous. I found something, he said as I sat down. Sabrina Clark, before she became Sabrina Doyle, was investigated for financial fraud 8 years ago. A former boyfriend filed a complaint with the police, claiming she had stolen over $20,000 from his accounts during their relationship. Credit cards opened in his name, checks, forged savings drained. My stomach tightened. What happened to the case? Nothing. Elliot's voice was flat. The boyfriend withdrew his complaint 3 weeks after filing it. According to the detective I spoke with, Sabrina's father made a personal visit to the young man. The details are murky, but the outcome is clear. Money changed hands, threats were made, and the whole thing disappeared. No charges, no record, nothing but a buried file that most people would never think to look for. So this was her pattern. She had done this before to someone else and gotten away with it. I wasn't her first victim. I was simply her latest, perhaps her largest. The realization made me feel sick and vindicated at the same time. Sick because my son had married a predator, vindicated because Eleanor's instincts had been right all along. There's something else. Elliot continued, pulling another document from the folder. I looked into Sabrina's family background. Her father, Richard Clark, was a successful businessman in Connecticut, commercial real estate, some development projects. By all accounts, he was worth several $1 million at his peak. He paused, letting the weight of the next word settle. He died 4 years ago, in poverty. I stared at him. How is that possible? That's exactly what I asked. According to public records, Richard Clark spent the last 2 years of his life in a rented apartment dependent on Social Security and a small pension. His business assets were liquidated, his properties sold, his investment accounts emptied. When he died, his estate was worth less than $8,000. Elliot leaned back, his expression grim. Strange, isn't it? A wealthy man dies broke while his children live comfortably. His daughter drives a luxury car, wears expensive clothes, takes vacations to places most people only see in magazines. The implication hung in the air between us, unspoken but unmistakable. Sabrina hadn't just defrauded a boyfriend. She had done something to her own father, drained his wealth while he was still alive, left him to die with nothing. And now she was doing the same thing to me. She targeted Daniel because of me, I said slowly, the pieces finally clicking into place. She saw the house, the savings, the stability. She saw an aging father with assets and a son who was easy to control. Their entire marriage was a long-term con. Elliot nodded. I believe so. Daniel was never the prize. You were. Your house, your pension, your savings, everything you and Eleanor spent a lifetime building. Sabrina saw it all as hers for the taking, and she was patient enough to wait years for the opportunity. I thought of Daniel, of his trembling hands at the coffee shop, his empty wallet, his confusion about what was normal in a marriage. He hadn't married a woman who loved him. He had married a woman who saw him as a tool, a means to an end. And by the time he realized it, he was too trapped, too controlled, too broken to escape. What do we do with this information? I asked. Elliot closed the folder and looked at me with an intensity that made me pay attention. We find someone willing to talk. The boyfriend who filed the complaint is a dead end. He's too scared or too paid off to cooperate. But Sabrina's father is a different story. He's dead, but he wasn't alone. He had a wife, Sabrina's mother. Martha Clark. I said, remembering the name from the little Daniel had told me about Sabrina's family. Sabrina barely mentions her, said they had a falling out years ago. I wonder why, Elliot replied dryly. A mother who watched her husband die in poverty while her children prospered might have a few things to say about her daughter. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the gray afternoon sky. I'm going to find her, Mr. Doyle. If anyone knows the full extent of what Sabrina is capable of, it's the woman who raised her. He turned back to face me, and his expression was grimmer than I had ever seen it. Someone was destroyed by Sabrina before you, he said quietly. And that person might want to talk. Daniel called me 3 days later, his voice barely above a whisper. Dad, I need to see you. Not at the cafe, somewhere private. Can I come to the house? There was something in his tone I hadn't heard before, not just the weariness I had grown accustomed to, but genuine fear. I told him to come immediately. He arrived within the hour, parking his car behind the garage where it couldn't be seen from the road. When he walked through the back door, he looked like a man who hadn't slept in days. His eyes were red-rimmed, his clothes wrinkled, and he kept glancing over his shoulder as if expecting someone to appear behind him. He was carrying a laptop under his arm, and his hands shook as he set it on the kitchen table. I found something, he said, not meeting my eyes. On the computer Sabrina and I share. She forgot to log out of her email and He trailed off, swallowing hard. I know I shouldn't have looked, but after what you told me about the bank, about the money, I couldn't stop thinking. I needed to know the truth. He opened the laptop and turned it toward me. On the screen was an email dated 6 years ago, sent from Sabrina's personal account to an address I didn't recognize. The subject line was empty, but the message itself was short, brutal, and unmistakable. Mom, it read, I've made my decision. If I marry Daniel, his father's house is the key. The property alone is worth $500,000, and the old man won't last forever. Once he's gone, everything passes to Daniel, which means it passes to me. This is our way out. Trust me. I read the words twice, 3 times, waiting for them to mean something different. But they didn't change. My daughter-in-law had written to her mother years before Eleanor died, laying out a plan to marry my son, not for love, not for partnership, but for inheritance. Daniel was never her husband. He was her investment, and I was simply an obstacle with an expiration date. I'm sorry, Dad. Daniel's voice cracked. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. I looked at my son, really looked at him, and saw not the weak man I had blamed for months, but someone far more tragic, a victim who had been manipulated so thoroughly he didn't even recognize the cage around him. Sabrina had chosen him carefully, had groomed him slowly, had isolated him from everyone who might have helped him see the truth. By the time their marriage solidified, Daniel had no friends left, no independence, no way out. When did you find this? I asked quietly. 2 nights ago. I confronted her. He laughed bitterly, a sound without humor. That was a mistake. What happened? Daniel's face went pale. She didn't deny it. She didn't even try to explain. She just looked at me with this coldness, like I was something she had scraped off her shoe. And then she said, if you say anything to your father, I'll destroy you. I have messages, photos, things you don't want anyone to see. Try me, Daniel. See what happens. The words hung in the air between us, ugly and threatening. I understood then the full scope of what Sabrina had done. She hadn't just stolen money or forged signatures. She had built a prison around my son brick by brick, using shame and secrets as her mortar. Daniel was terrified of her, not because she might leave him, but because she had weaponized his own life against him. Daniel, I said carefully, did your mother ever say anything to you about Sabrina before she passed? He was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow. Once, about a year before she got sick, Mom took me aside after Thanksgiving dinner and asked if I was happy, really happy. I told her of course I was. She looked at me with this expression like she wanted to say more but couldn't find the words. Finally she said, if you ever need help, come to me, no matter what, promise me. I promised, but I didn't understand what she meant. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. I think I understand now. Eleanor had tried. Even with Daniel, she had tried to plant a seed of awareness to leave a door open in case he ever needed to escape. But he hadn't been ready to hear it. He had been too deep in Sabrina's web, too convinced that his marriage was normal, too afraid of what admitting the truth would mean. Your mother saw what Sabrina was, I said gently. She tried to protect both of us. She left me documents, warnings, people I could trust. She knew this day might come. Daniel looked up at me, and for the first time since he arrived, I saw something other than fear in his eyes. I saw the faint flicker of hope, fragile and desperate like a candle in a storm. Dad, he said, his voice breaking on the word, she controls everything, including me. The words hung between us like a confession, waiting to be completed. Daniel sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Eleanor and I had shared thousands of meals, where we had discussed our hopes and fears and dreams, and I watched my son struggle to find the courage to tell me the rest. His hands trembled around the coffee mug I had placed in front of him, and his eyes carried the hollow look of someone who had been carrying a weight too heavy for far too long. "Tell me everything," I said quietly. "From the beginning." And he did. It started small. Daniel explained the way these things always do. Shortly after they married, Sabrina suggested she handle their finances since she was better with numbers. Daniel agreed without hesitation. He was busy with work, grateful to have one less responsibility. She set up a joint account where both their paychecks were deposited, and for the first year, everything seemed normal. But gradually, imperceptibly, the boundaries shifted. Sabrina moved their savings to an account only she could access for security. She started giving Daniel cash each week instead of letting him use the debit card, explaining that they needed to budget more carefully. $50 a week, she decided. That was his allowance. I told myself it made sense. Daniel said, his voice cracking. She said all wives manage household finances. She said I was lucky to have someone who cared enough to keep us on track. I believed her because I wanted to believe her. Because the alternative was admitting that my marriage was something else entirely. The control expanded from there. Sabrina monitored his phone, checking his messages and call history daily. She tracked his location through an app she insisted was for safety. She opened credit cards in his name without telling him, ran up balances he knew nothing about. When Daniel finally discovered the debt, $25,000 on 3 different cards, Sabrina convinced him it was his fault somehow, that he had agreed to it and simply forgotten. She made him feel crazy, made him doubt his own memory, his own perception of reality. "I owe $25,000 I never spent," Daniel said, the words coming out like broken glass. "I can't buy lunch without asking permission. I can't visit my own father without explaining where I'm going and when I'll be back. She reads my emails, listens to my phone calls, controls every aspect of my life." He looked at me with eyes that had finally stopped hiding. "I thought this was normal, Dad. She told me this was what marriage looked like, and I had nothing to compare it to. I didn't realize it was abuse until I saw her do the same thing to you." The anger I had carried toward Daniel for months, the frustration at his silence, his complicity, his failure to stand up for me dissolved in that moment like morning frost in sunlight. My son wasn't weak. He wasn't a co-conspirator. He was a man who had been systematically broken by someone who understood exactly how to exploit his trust, his love, his desperate need to believe that his wife was who she pretended to be. Sabrina had done to Daniel what she was now doing to me, only she had years to perfect her technique, years to erode his sense of self until there was nothing left but obedience and fear. I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. "This is not your fault," I said firmly. "None of this is your fault." Daniel broke. The tears he had been fighting finally won, spilling down his cheeks as his shoulders shook with silent sobs. I moved to the chair beside him and held my son the way I had when he was a child, when nightmares woke him in the darkness, and the only cure was his father's arms around him. We stayed like that for a long time, 2 men broken by the same woman finally finding their way back to each other. Later that day, I brought Daniel to meet Elliot. My son was terrified, convinced that any action against Sabrina would result in the destruction she had promised. But Elliot listened to his story with the careful attention of a man who had seen this pattern before, and when Daniel finished, the attorney leaned forward with something close to hope in his eyes. "Your testimony changes everything," Elliot said. "You're not just a witness to what Sabrina did to your father, you're a victim yourself. Financial abuse, emotional manipulation, identity theft through those credit cards. These are crimes, Daniel. And your willingness to testify proves you have nothing to gain and everything to lose by telling the truth. That makes you credible in ways that hired experts and paper trails never could be." Daniel looked uncertain. "She'll destroy me if I do this. She has things, leverage ways to hurt me." "She already has," Elliot replied gently. "The question is whether you want to spend the rest of your life under her control, or whether you're ready to take it back." The silence stretched long enough for me to hear the wind rattling the windows outside. Then Daniel turned to me, and in his eyes I saw the boy I'd raised, the son I had loved, fighting his way back to the surface after years of drowning. He gripped my hand tightly, his fingers cold but his grip fierce. "Tell me what to do, Dad," he said. I'll do anything to make this right. The days following Daniel's confession were filled with careful planning and quiet determination. My son moved through the house like a man slowly waking from a long nightmare, uncertain of what was real and what had been manufactured by years of manipulation. I gave him Eleanor's guest room and told him to stay as long as he needed. Sabrina called his phone constantly, leaving voicemails that alternated between sweet concern and thinly veiled threats. Daniel listened to none of them. He simply turned off the phone and placed it in a drawer as if burying a piece of himself he no longer wanted to carry. Elliot worked around the clock assembling the evidence we had gathered into a case file that grew thicker by the day. The transaction records from Gerald Eleanor's meticulous notes, the GPS tracker, the forged loan documents, Daniel's testimony about the credit cards opened in his name. Each piece added weight to the portrait of Sabrina as a calculated predator who had spent years positioning herself to drain my family of everything we had built. But Elliot wanted more. He wanted to establish a pattern that stretched beyond me, beyond Daniel, to show that Sabrina had done this before and would do it again if not stopped. Then, on a Thursday morning that began like any other, Elliot called me with news that changed everything. "I'd just received a phone call," he said, his voice carrying an edge of controlled excitement. "From Martha Clark, Sabrina's mother." I sat down heavily in my kitchen chair. "I thought they were estranged." "They are, have been for 3 years. But Martha saw something in the news about a financial fraud investigation in Vermont. Apparently, Gerald's compliance report triggered some local media interest. She recognized the names, put the pieces together, and tracked me down through my firm's website." Elliot paused. "Raymond, she wants to meet with us. She says she has information about her daughter that we need to hear." 2 days later, Daniel and I sat in Elliot's office as Martha Clark was escorted through the door. She was a woman in her early 60s with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and eyes that carried the permanent sadness of someone who had lost more than could ever be recovered. She moved carefully, as if the weight of what she was about to share made each step difficult. When she saw Daniel, she stopped. "You must be him," she said softly. "The husband. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for what my daughter did to you." Daniel couldn't speak. He simply knotted his jaw tight. Martha settled into the chair Elliot offered and folded her hands in her lap. For a long moment, she said nothing, gathering herself for the story she had come to tell. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but heavy with grief. "My daughter destroyed my husband," she began. "Richard and I were married for 38 years. He built a successful business, commercial real estate mostly, and we had a comfortable life. Not wealthy by most standards, but secure. We raised 2 children, Sabrina and her brother Kyle. I thought we had done well by them. I thought they would grow up to be good people." She paused, her composure flickering. "I was wrong." She explained what had happened slowly, methodically, as if recounting the details of a crime she had witnessed, but been powerless to stop. It started when Richard began showing signs of early dementia, small lapses in memory that the doctors said were normal for his age. Sabrina volunteered to help manage his affairs, and Richard, trusting his daughter, agreed. What followed was a systematic dismantling of everything he had built. She transferred his assets to accounts she controlled, Martha said. The business, the properties, the investments, all of it moved piece by piece over 2 years. Kyle helped her. They forged his signatures, manipulated his confusion, convinced him to sign documents he didn't understand. By the time I realized what was happening, there was nothing left. Richard died, owning nothing but the clothes in his closet and the shame of knowing his own children had betrayed him. The room was silent. Daniel stared at the floor, his face pale. I thought of Eleanor's notes, her careful observations, her certainty that something was deeply wrong with Sabrina. My wife had seen the predator beneath the surface. She had tried to warn us all. "I confronted them," Martha continued. "After Richard's funeral, I told Sabrina and Kyle I knew what they had done. Sabrina didn't even try to deny it. She looked at me and said, he was going to die anyway. Why should his money rot in a bank when we could use it? That was the last time I spoke to either of them, 3 years ago." Elliot leaned forward. "Mrs. Clark, do you have any documentation of what they did to your husband?" Martha reached into her purse and withdrew a thick envelope. "Emails," she said. "Messages Sabrina sent me over the years before and after Richard's death. She talked about her plans, her strategies, always in that same cold language she uses for everything. I kept them because I knew someday someone would need proof of what she is. She placed the envelope on Elliot's desk. I also have something else, something urgent. She pulled out a printed confirmation page. Sabrina and Kyle have booked flights to Toronto. They leave in 5 days, one-way tickets. The implications hit me like a physical blow. They were planning to run to take whatever money they had stolen and disappear across the border before anyone could stop them. All the evidence we had gathered, all the careful preparation would mean nothing if they escaped. Elliot took the confirmation page and studied it, his expression hardening. "They're liquidating what they can and fleeing," he said. "They know the walls are closing in." Martha looked at me, her eyes filled with a pain I recognized too well. "I couldn't save my husband," she said quietly. "But maybe I can help save you. Don't let her win, Mr. Doyle. Don't let her do to your family what she did to mine." Elliot stood and walked to the window, his mind clearly racing through options and timelines. When he turned back to face us, his expression was grim but determined. "They're running," he said. "We have 5 days to stop them." The next 5 days became a blur of legal filings, urgent phone calls, and sleepless nights. Elliot worked with a ferocity I had never seen before, assembling our evidence into an emergency motion that would be presented to a federal judge. Martha Clark stayed in Vermont, providing additional documentation and answering questions about her daughter's history of financial manipulation. Daniel remained at my house, alternating between moments of resolve and waves of guilt that left him sitting silently at the kitchen table, staring at nothing. I understood his conflict. Despite everything, Sabrina was still his wife. The woman he had married, believing she loved him, was about to have her life dismantled, and some part of him, the part that had spent years rationalizing her behavior, still struggled to accept the truth. On the morning of the 3rd day, Elliot filed the emergency injunction. The motion was comprehensive, detailing the pattern of fraud that stretched from Richard Clark's stolen estate to the money taken from my accounts. It included Gerald's bank records, Eleanor's documented observations, the forged loan application, Martha's emails, the flight confirmations, and Daniel's testimony about his own financial abuse. The evidence painted a picture of 2 people, Sabrina and Kyle, who had spent years systematically destroying their own father, and were now attempting the same scheme on a new victim before fleeing the country. The judge reviewed the motion within hours. By that afternoon, Elliot called with news that made me grip the phone until my knuckles turned white. "It's done," he said. The judge granted the injunction. All accounts linked to Sabrina and Kyle Clark are frozen as of 30 minutes ago. Their passports have been flagged. If either of them tries to leave the country, they'll be stopped at the airport. "We've cut off their escape route, Raymond. They're not going anywhere." I relayed the news to Daniel, who received it with a mixture of relief and dread. We both knew that cornering Sabrina would make her desperate, and desperate people were unpredictable. We didn't have to wait long to see the proof. That evening, my phone began buzzing with notifications from Gerald. Sabrina had attempted to access my accounts 3 times in rapid succession, each attempt blocked by the security protocols Gerald had implemented weeks earlier. When direct access failed, she tried calling the bank, demanding to speak with the manager about her father-in-law's accounts. Gerald informed her calmly that she had no authorization and no legal standing, and that any further attempts would be reported to the authorities. She hung up without another word. But Sabrina wasn't finished. The following morning, Elliot forwarded me a series of emails that had been sent to Adult Protective Services, the local police department, and several news organizations. The messages, sent from an anonymous account, accused me of suffering from severe dementia and claimed that I was being financially exploited by unscrupulous attorneys and family members. The emails painted a picture of a confused old man being manipulated into making false accusations against his loving daughter-in-law. They called for an immediate investigation into elder abuse and demanded that my so-called evidence be dismissed as the ramblings of a deteriorating mind. Elliot traced the IP address within an hour. The emails had been sent from Sabrina's home computer using a proxy service that was easily penetrated by someone with the right technical resources. Her attempt to discredit me had only added another piece of evidence to the growing case against her evidence of witness intimidation and obstruction of justice. "She's panicking," Elliot said when he called to inform me. "Her money is frozen, her escape route is blocked, and her only play left is to attack your credibility. But she's doing it clumsily, leaving digital fingerprints everywhere. Every move she makes now only digs her hole deeper." On the 5th day, The trap closed completely. Kyle Clark arrived at Burlington International Airport at 6 in the morning carrying a single suitcase and a one-way ticket to Montreal. He had rebooked his flight without telling Sabrina, moving his departure up by 2 days in what could only have been an attempt to abandon his sister and save himself. But when he approached the security checkpoint, 2 federal agents were waiting. The arrest was quiet, efficient, and utterly devastating to Kyle's composure. According to the agent's report, he began talking before they even finished reading his rights. He asked about deals, about reduced sentences, about what he could offer in exchange for leniency. He was, as Elliot had predicted, exactly the kind of person who would sacrifice anyone, including his own sister, to protect himself. Sabrina learned of her brother's arrest 3 hours later when she tried to call him and found his phone disconnected. She drove to the airport, demanded information, and was informed that Kyle had been taken into federal custody on charges of wire fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. She stood in the terminal, according to witnesses, completely motionless for several minutes, as if unable to process that her partner in every scheme, the brother who had helped her drain their own father's wealth, had fled without her and been caught. I was sitting in my living room that evening, watching the sunset paint Eleanor's lilies in shades of gold and orange, when my phone rang. Elliot's name appeared on the screen. "Kyle is talking," Elliot said, and I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. "He's been in interrogation for 6 hours, and he's giving them everything. Names, account numbers, timelines, the whole operation. He's confirmed that Sabrina was the mastermind behind the fraud against both you and their father. He's explained how they forged documents, moved money, planned their escape." Elliot paused, letting the weight of the next word settle. "Raymond, he's also confirmed that Sabrina has been planning this since before she married Daniel. She targeted your family deliberately, knowing exactly what she intended to take." I closed my eyes, feeling the full impact of what he was telling me. Every suspicion Eleanor had harbored, every warning sign I had dismissed, every moment of doubt I had pushed aside, all of it had been justified. My daughter-in-law had entered our lives as a predator, and only now, years later, was the full scope of her betrayal becoming clear. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now," Elliot replied, "we finish this. Kyle is talking Raymond, and he's giving us everything." The emergency hearing took place in a federal courtroom in Burlington, a wood-paneled room that smelled of old paper and furniture polish. I arrived early with Elliot Daniel following a few steps behind, like a man walking toward his own execution. The gravity of what was about to happen weighed on all of us. This was not a trial that would come later, but an evidentiary hearing to determine whether the injunction against Sabrina would be made permanent and whether formal charges would proceed. For Sabrina, it was a last chance to convince a judge that she was the victim, not the perpetrator. She arrived with an attorney I didn't recognize, a sharp-featured woman in an expensive suit who radiated confidence as she guided Sabrina to the defense table. Sabrina herself looked different than I had ever seen her, softer. Somehow, her usual coldness replaced by an expression of wounded innocence. She wore a modest dress, minimal jewelry, and kept dabbing at her eyes with a tissue as if fighting back tears. It was a performance, and I wondered how many times she had rehearsed it. The hearing began with Sabrina's attorney presenting her defense. The argument was exactly what Elliot had predicted. I was an elderly man, possibly suffering from cognitive decline, who had voluntarily gifted money to my son and daughter-in-law during a difficult financial period. Now, manipulated by opportunistic lawyers and estranged family members, I was making accusations I didn't fully understand. Sabrina was not a criminal, the attorney insisted. She was a devoted wife and daughter-in-law who had been unfairly targeted by people with their own agendas. "My client has done nothing but try to help her father-in-law," the attorney declared, her voice thick with manufactured sympathy. "She managed family finances because Mr. Doyle asked her to. She visited the bank on his behalf because he found the process confusing. Every action she took was motivated by love and concern for an aging man who now tragically has been turned against her by those who seek to profit from his confusion." I sat motionless, listening to lies wrapped in the language of compassion. Beside me, Elliot remained calm, making occasional notes on his legal pad. He had warned me this would happen. "Let them talk," he had said. "The more they claim, the harder the evidence will hit." When it was our turn, Elliot presented the evidence, methodically building the case piece by piece. First came Gerald Whitman, who testified about the unauthorized transfers and the forged loan application. Then came the surveillance footage, grainy but unmistakable, showing Sabrina at the bank counter, signing documents while glancing nervously over her shoulder. Gerald explained how he had recognized the forgery immediately, how the bank's compliance department had launched a quiet investigation, how every piece of evidence pointed to systematic fraud rather than family generosity. Next came the GPS tracker entered into evidence, along with documentation of Sabrina's pattern of appearing wherever I went. Martha Clark's emails were read aloud, including the message from 6 years ago where Sabrina had described my house as the key and my death as an opportunity. The judge's expression grew increasingly severe as each piece of evidence accumulated. Then Kyle was brought in to testify. He looked diminished somehow. Smaller than I remembered his earlier arrogance, replaced by the desperate compliance of a man trying to save himself. Under questioning, he confirmed everything: the scheme against their father, the plan to defraud me, the forged documents, the intention to flee to Canada. He spoke in a flat, emotionless voice, reciting facts like a man reading from a script. When asked who had masterminded the operation, he didn't hesitate. "Sabrina," he said. "It was always Sabrina. She planned everything. I just did what she told me." I watched Sabrina's face as her brother testified against her. The mask of wounded innocence cracked, revealing something harder underneath rage, barely contained hatred burning behind her eyes. Finally, Daniel was called to the stand. My son walked to the witness box like a man approaching a cliff's edge, knowing he had to jump but terrified of the fall. He sat down, raised his right hand, and swore to tell the truth. Then he looked directly at Sabrina for the first time since the hearing began. He told them everything: the weekly allowance, the credit cards opened in his name without consent, the constant monitoring of his phone and location. He described years of manipulation that had left him unable to distinguish between love and control. He explained how he had discovered the email revealing Sabrina's true intentions, how she had threatened to destroy him if he spoke to me. His voice shook at times, but he never stopped. He testified against his own wife, knowing it would end his marriage, knowing it would expose his own failures, knowing there was no going back. Sabrina glared at him throughout her eyes, burning with a fury that made the air in the courtroom feel charged. Daniel saw the hatred in her face, the woman he had loved transformed into something unrecognizable, but he didn't look away. He held her gaze and kept speaking, kept telling the truth, kept choosing his father over his fear. When Daniel finished, the courtroom fell silent. Sabrina's attorney had no redirect, no way to repair the damage. The judge called for a brief recess, and as the bailiff began to escort Kyle back to custody, Sabrina finally broke. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor, and pointed at her brother with a trembling finger. "You betrayed me," she screamed, her voice echoing through the courtroom. "After everything I did for you, everything we built together, you sold me out to save yourself." Kyle stopped and turned to face his sister. His expression was empty, devoid of guilt or remorse. When he spoke, his voice was cold enough to freeze the air between them. "I learned from you." The recess ended, but the tension in the courtroom only intensified. Sabrina had been forced back into her seat by her attorney, who whispered urgently in her ear while casting nervous glances at the judge. The outburst against Kyle had damaged whatever remained of Sabrina's carefully constructed image. The grieving daughter-in-law, the misunderstood wife, those masks had shattered, revealing the fury underneath. Now her attorney faced the impossible task of rebuilding credibility from ruins. When the hearing resumed, Sabrina's attorney made one final desperate play. She called for Gerald Whitman to be recalled to the stand and launched into an aggressive cross-examination designed to undermine everything he had testified. "Mr. Whitman," she began, her voice sharp, "you've presented yourself as a neutral banking professional simply doing his job. But isn't it true that you have a personal connection to the Doyle family, that your involvement in this case goes far beyond professional duty?" Gerald remained calm, his hands folded in his lap. "I'm not sure what you're implying." "I'm implying bias, Mr. Whitman. I'm suggesting that you targeted my client because of a personal relationship with Raymond Doyle, not because of any genuine concern about fraud." The courtroom grew quiet. I felt Daniel tense beside me, uncertain where this was heading. Elliot showed no reaction, but I noticed his pen had stopped moving across his notepad. Gerald looked at the attorney for a long moment, then turned to address the judge directly. "Your Honor, I'd like to clarify something for the record." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of a secret finally being released. "Eleanor Doyle was my cousin. We grew up together in the same small town, attended the same schools, remained close throughout our adult lives. 5 years ago, when Eleanor learned she was dying, she came to me with a request. She asked me to watch over her husband's accounts after she was gone. She was worried not about Raymond's judgment, but about someone in the family who she believed posed a threat. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Sabrina's attorney stood frozen, clearly not expecting this revelation. I didn't break any banking rules, Gerald continued steadily. I followed every protocol, reported every suspicious activity through proper channels, documented everything according to federal guidelines. But I also kept a promise to my cousin. I watched, I waited, and when the fraud began, I was ready. The judge leaned forward. Mr. Whitman, why didn't you disclose this relationship earlier? Because Eleanor asked me not to, Your Honor. She didn't want Raymond to know she had arranged protection for him. She wanted him to live his remaining years without fear, without suspicion. She hoped her precautions would never be needed. Gerald's voice softened. She was wrong. But because she prepared, her husband had a chance to fight back. I sat in stunned silence as the full picture finally emerged. Eleanor hadn't just left documents in a safe or written letters of warning. She had built an entire network of protection, positioning people she trusted in places where they could help me when I needed it most. Maggie to watch over the family dynamics, Gerald to guard the finances, Elliot to provide legal defense, the red envelope and its contents as a final insurance policy. My wife had known she was dying, and instead of surrendering to grief, she had spent her remaining time constructing a safety net that would catch me years after her death. The revelation broke something in Sabrina. Whatever composure she had managed to recover evaporated completely. She stood abruptly, shoving her attorney aside, her face contorted with rage. "This is a conspiracy," she screamed, pointing at me, at Gerald, at Elliot. "They planned this together. They're all lying. I never forged anything. Raymond gave me that money. He wanted to help us. He's senile. He doesn't remember they're manipulating a sick old man." The judge banged her gavel. "Mrs. Doyle, sit down immediately." But Sabrina was beyond reason. That house should be mine. We waited years for him to die, and he just kept living. Eleanor was supposed to leave everything to Daniel, but she changed the trust. She cut us out. She stopped mid-sentence, realizing what she had just admitted. The courtroom went absolutely silent. Sabrina's attorney covered her face with her hands. Even Kyle, still seated in the witness area under guard, stared at his sister in disbelief. "She cut us out," Sabrina had said. "We waited years for him to die." The judge's voice was ice. "Mrs. Doyle, you have just made statements against your own interest in open court. I strongly advise you to stop speaking immediately." She turned to the bailiff. "Based on the evidence presented and the defendant's own admissions, I'm ordering Sabrina Clark Doyle held without bail, pending full trial on charges of wire fraud, identity theft, forgery, and conspiracy. Remove her from my courtroom." 2 bailiffs approached Sabrina, who finally seemed to understand what she had done. The rage drained from her face, replaced by something closer to shock. "No," she whispered. "No, wait, I didn't mean..." The handcuffs clicked around her wrists. She struggled briefly, then went limp, allowing herself to be led toward the side door. As she passed Daniel, she stopped and looked at him with an expression that mixed hatred with something almost like grief. "You were supposed to love me," she said quietly. Daniel met her gaze without flinching. "I did. That was my mistake." The door closed behind her and she was gone. I stood slowly, my legs unsteady beneath me. The courtroom buzzed with murmured conversations, attorneys gathering papers, the machinery of justice grinding forward. But I heard none of it. I reached into my jacket pocket and felt the small photograph I had carried with me every day since Eleanor's funeral. Her face smiling up at me from our 35th anniversary, frozen in a moment of pure happiness. I held it against my chest, and for the first time in months, I breathed freely. 3 months passed before the full weight of justice finally fell. The trial had been exhausting weeks of testimony, evidence review, and legal arguments that dissected every aspect of Sabrina's scheme. I attended every day. Sitting in the same seat in the gallery, watching as the truth I had lived through was presented to 12 strangers who would decide my daughter-in-law's fate. Daniel sat beside me for most of it, though there were days when the testimony became too painful and he had to step outside to compose himself. I never blamed him for those moments. He was watching his marriage be autopsied in public, every manipulation and lie exposed under fluorescent lights. The verdict came on a gray February morning. Guilty on all counts: wire fraud, forgery, identity theft, stalking. The jury had deliberated for less than 4 hours, a speed that Elliot said reflected the overwhelming nature of the evidence. When the forewoman read the verdicts aloud, Sabrina sat motionless at the defense table, her face betraying nothing. Whatever fire had consumed her during the emergency hearing had burned out, leaving behind only ashes and silence. Sentencing followed 2 weeks later. The judge reviewed Sabrina's pattern of behavior, the destruction of her own father, the systematic abuse of her husband, the calculated fraud against me, and determined that this was not a crime of impulse or desperation. It was predation, methodical, and remorseless. 8 years in federal prison with no possibility of early release. Kyle, whose cooperation had been instrumental in securing the conviction, received 3 years. He would serve his time in a minimum security facility, emerging as a middle-aged man with nothing but the consequences of his choices waiting for him. The court also ordered full restitution. Every dollar stolen from my accounts would be returned, recovered from the frozen assets Sabrina and Kyle had accumulated over years of fraud. The forged loan was declared void, my house protected exactly as Eleanor's trust had intended. When the final judgment was read, I felt something I hadn't expected, not triumph, but exhaustion. The battle was over. I had won. But victory tasted more like survival than celebration. Daniel was cleared of all involvement, officially recognized as a victim rather than a co-conspirator. The credit card debt Sabrina had accumulated in his name was discharged as fraudulent. He moved into an apartment in Burlington and began seeing a therapist who specialized in survivors of domestic abuse. The word felt strange when applied to my son abuse, but I had learned that control and manipulation leave wounds as real as any physical violence. Daniel was learning that too slowly, painfully rebuilding an identity that had been systematically dismantled over years of marriage. A week after the sentencing, a letter arrived at my house addressed in careful, childish handwriting. The return address was Daniel's new apartment, but the letter was from Emily, my 12-year-old granddaughter. I opened it with trembling hands, uncertain what to expect from a child whose mother had just been sent to prison. Dear Grandpa. The letter began. Dad told me what happened with Mom. I don't understand all of it, but I know she hurt you and that's why she has to go away. I'm sorry I didn't visit more. Mom always said you were too busy or too sick or didn't want to see us. I believed her because she was my mom, and I thought moms told the truth. Now I know that wasn't true. Dad says you're kind and good, and that Grandma Eleanor loved you very much. I want to know my real grandfather, the one Mom kept me away from. Can I come visit sometime? I promise I'll be good. Love, Emily. I read the letter 3 times, tears blurring the words until I could barely see them. This child, caught in the wreckage of her mother's destruction, was reaching out with a grace I could hardly comprehend. I wrote back immediately, telling her she was welcome any time that I had stories about her grandmother. I wanted to share, that my door would always be open. Daniel came to visit the following Sunday. We sat on the porch, despite the cold, wrapped in heavy coats, watching the bare trees sway against a pale winter sky. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The silence between us had changed, no longer the uncomfortable avoidance of unspoken truths, but the quiet of 2 people who had finally run out of things to hide. I'm sorry, Dad. Daniel's voice was hoarse. For all of it. For not seeing what she was, for not protecting you, for being too weak to stand up when it mattered. I don't expect you to forgive me. I just need you to know that I understand now, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be better. I looked at my son, really looked at him, and saw not the broken man Sabrina had created, but the boy I had raised, the child Eleanor and I had loved with everything we had. He was still there, buried under years of damage, waiting to be found again. You're my son, I said simply. We start over, but this time with truth. Daniel nodded, his eyes glistening. I opened my arms and he leaned into the embrace, awkward, uncertain, but sincere. We held each other on that cold porch, father and son beginning the long work of rebuilding what had been broken. When I walked out of the courthouse after the final hearing, the winter air sharp against my face, someone was waiting for me. Maggie stood at the bottom of the steps, her coat pulled tight against the wind, holding a bouquet of white lilies, Eleanor's favorite flowers. Maggie smiled as I descended the courthouse steps, the white lilies bright against the gray February afternoon. She didn't say anything at first, just handed me the flowers and fell into step beside me as we walked to my truck. The blooms smelled exactly as I remembered, sweet and delicate, the scent that had filled our home every spring when Eleanor tended her garden. I held them carefully as if they were something precious and fragile, which I suppose they were. "She would be proud of you," Maggie said quietly. "You know that, right?" I nodded, not trusting my voice to respond. A week later, Maggie appeared at my door carrying a covered dish and wearing an apron dusted with flour. "Apple pie," she announced, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "Eleanor's recipe. She taught me how to make it years ago, made me promise to bake it for you if she ever couldn't." She set the dish on the kitchen counter and turned to face me with an expression that was gentle but firm. "She also made me promise something else, Raymond. She said, if Raymond ever needs someone after I'm gone, be there for him. He'll try to handle everything alone. Don't let him." The words hit me harder than I expected. Eleanor had known me so well, known that grief would make me retreat into silence, that pride would keep me from asking for help, that I would carry every burden alone rather than admit I was struggling. She had prepared for that too, just as she had prepared for everything else. She had given Maggie instructions the same way she had positioned Gerald and Elliot. Even in death, she was still taking care of me. I sat down at the kitchen table, and for the first time since Eleanor's funeral, I allowed myself to truly grieve. Not the controlled sorrow I had permitted in small doses, but the deep, wrenching loss I had kept locked away for 2 years. Maggie sat beside me, saying nothing, her hand resting on my arm as I wept for the woman I had loved, the life we had built, the future we would never share. She let me cry until there was nothing left, and then she cut 2 slices of pie and placed one in front of me. "Eat," she said simply. "Then we'll talk about what comes next." That evening, after Maggie had gone home, I returned to the bedroom safe. There was one envelope I had never opened, a second letter Eleanor had left sealed and tucked behind the documents I had already read. I had been afraid of it, afraid that reading her final words would somehow make her death more real, more permanent. But the fear felt distant, now softened by everything I had survived. I opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. "My dearest Ray." It began in the handwriting I would recognize anywhere. "If you're reading this, it means you fought and you won. I knew you would. You're stronger than you've ever believed, braver than you've ever admitted. I'm so proud of you. Proud of the man you're, proud of the life we built together. Proud that I got to spend 41 years loving you. But now I need you to do something for me. Something harder than fighting, harder than winning. I need you to live. Not for my memory, not out of obligation to what we had, but for yourself. Find joy again, Raymond. Let yourself laugh without guilt. Let yourself love without fear. The years ahead of you are a gift, and I don't want you to spend them looking backward at what we lost. Look forward. Build something new. Be happy. That's my last wish. That's all I've ever wanted for you. Forever yours, Eleanor." I read the letter 3 times, memorizing every word, letting her voice fill the empty spaces in my heart. Then I folded it carefully, placed it back in the envelope, and set it beside her photograph on the mantel. The following Sunday, I hosted dinner at the house for the first time in years. Daniel arrived early to help me cook his movements in the kitchen, still uncertain but willing. Emily came clutching a handmade card she had decorated with flowers and hearts, her eyes wide as she explored the home her mother had kept her from. Maggie brought another pie and a bottle of wine. Gerald arrived last, carrying a bouquet of white lilies to add to the vase on the windowsill. We gathered around the dining table, the same table where Eleanor and I had shared thousands of meals, and for a few hours the house felt alive again. Emily asked about her grandmother, questions she had never been allowed to ask before, and I found myself telling stories I hadn't spoken aloud in years. The time Eleanor got lost in Boston and ended up making friends with a street musician. The anniversary when I tried to cook her a fancy dinner and nearly burned down the kitchen. The way she laughed with her whole body, unable to contain her joy. The stories made us laugh and cry, sometimes at the same time, and I realized this was what Eleanor had wanted, not a shrine to her memory, but a family that remembered her with love. After everyone left, I stood alone by the window, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and rose. Eleanor's photograph sat on the mantel, her smile unchanged, her eyes still holding that spark of warmth I had fallen in love with 41 years ago. The white lilies bloomed beside her, their petals glowing in the fading light. "I kept my promise, Eleanor. I whispered. And now, I'm ready to live again. The seasons turned as they always do. Spring arrived in Vermont with its familiar rituals, melting snow, returning birds, and the first green shoots pushing through the thawed earth. I planted new lilies beside Eleanor's original garden white blooms that would flower alongside the ones she had tended for decades. Daniel visited every other weekend now, sometimes bringing Emily, who had become fascinated with her grandmother's stories, and insisted on hearing a new one each time. Maggie remained a steady presence, dropping by for coffee and conversation, keeping the promise she had made to her oldest friend. Gerald retired from the bank that summer and joined our Sunday dinners, completing the circle Eleanor had drawn around me before she died. I still talk to Eleanor's photograph each morning. I still water her lilies and tell her about my days, but the conversations have changed. They're no longer filled with grief or loneliness. Now I tell her about Emily's latest drawings, about Daniel's progress in therapy, about the laughter that fills the house when family gathers around the table. I tell her that I kept my promise, that I fought and won, and that I'm finally learning to live again. If this story touched your heart, I hope you'll share it with someone who needs to hear it. Perhaps you faced betrayal from people you trusted, or watched someone you love struggle against manipulation. Perhaps you're still fighting your own battle. Whatever your story, remember, this kindness is not weakness, but kindness. Without boundaries is an invitation to be used. Protect yourself, trust the people who prove themselves worthy, and never stop believing that justice, though slow, will find its way. Thank you for staying until the end. Leave a comment and tell me, have you ever discovered that someone you trusted was not who they pretended to be? I'd love to hear your story. And if you haven't already, subscribe so you won't miss what comes next.